Since the beginning of the week, my colleagues and I have received an unforgettable shock. An unexpected meeting announced that the family business had been sold to a private equity firm, and we, who had been loyal to this company for decades, were laid off immediately. But what happens when they ask us to reapply for jobs we've done for a lifetime, with reduced pay and double the responsibilities? Perhaps what's coming next will be something you never saw coming. On Monday morning, when I walked into the meeting room as usual, I never could have imagined that it would be one of the most memorable meetings of my career. The room was packed, but the atmosphere felt heavier than usual. The CEO, who had been with us for many years, stood in the center of the room with a serious expression and began to announce some unbelievable news. The family business we had dedicated most of our lives to had officially been sold to a private equity firm. The words hit me like a sudden shock, and I couldn't believe what I was hearing. One by one, the people around me started asking each other, "Did I hear that right? What? The company was sold?" But no, everything was true. At that moment, I realized this wasn't a joke. The private equity firm had bought our company in a deal called an asset sale. This was a strategy none of us, not even the most experienced among us, had anticipated. The CEO continued, speaking in a somber yet firm tone, that as of today, we were all being laid off. No warning, no opportunity to prepare, just a cold announcement. But there was one more thing that hit me even harder. You can reapply for your jobs under the new ownership, but pay and benefits will be cut, and your responsibilities will suddenly increase. The room went silent. No one spoke. There was only the sound of heavy sighs. Everything felt like it was collapsing in front of me. We, the people who had worked for this company for 18 or even 25 years, were suddenly being discarded like excess employees, cut out from the history of the company we had built. The shock and sense of loss made it hard for me to think clearly. Everything we had worked for, everything we had built together, seemed to be falling apart because of a cold decision made by distant investors. After the meeting, the atmosphere in the company turned tense and hollow. People scattered, each lost in their own thoughts, and no one said a word. Many of us had been here since the company was just starting, watching it grow and hit important milestones, and now it felt like everything was collapsing in an instant. A few people stood nearby, whispering about what had just happened, what we would face in the future. No one ever imagined such an ending. People like me, who had been with the company since our youth, had different expectations of how this company would evolve. But now, we were being cast aside like assets with no value. After the meeting, the atmosphere in the company became so heavy it was almost suffocating. People left the meeting room in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. No one could come up with a reasonable explanation for this decision. We had devoted most of our lives to this company, but now all we received in return was coldness and unacceptable conditions. They told us we could reapply for our jobs, but that only made everything feel more harsh. We were the ones who had built the company, who had supported each other through the highs and lows, and now we were treated like expendable assets in a game that wasn't fair. Before long, I saw a few colleagues gathering near the front desk. On the table there was a stack of new job application forms, neatly placed next to donuts and coffee cups, but no one was touching them. None of us felt motivated to take action. We weren't the ones who needed to prove anything anymore. We had already given our all. The small offerings of donuts and coffee couldn't soothe the growing sense of sadness and disappointment in each of us. The newly hired manager, standing right next to the table receiving applications, seemed to have no idea what was going on. He tried to smile and welcome everyone as if we were all ready to reapply immediately. But no one approached him. All of our eyes were fixed on him. But not with expectation, only with coldness and the feeling that we had been abandoned. Maybe he had never understood the bond we shared with this company, or perhaps he didn't realize that the new conditions they had offered weren't enough to make us return. The feeling of disappointment began to spread. A few people, those who had been with the company for 20, even 30 years, were standing nearby, silently observing the scene. I could see that they weren't just thinking about themselves, but about all the colleagues they had worked with. Some started chatting, discussing what to do next, but no one really wanted to talk about reapplying. Eventually, everyone scattered, each of us absorbed in our own thoughts. Meanwhile, I couldn't stop thinking about the years that had passed. This company wasn't just a place where I worked, it was my second home. How many times had my colleagues and I faced challenges together, reached new heights, and shared failures? Those memories now felt like an old film, but what I couldn't let go of was the indifference and lack of respect we were receiving from the new owners. The atmosphere in the company grew increasingly subdued. Each of us faced a difficult decision. Should we reapply for a job with lower pay, heavier responsibilities, or should we walk away, accepting the change that we couldn't change? Everyone remained silent, unsure of the answer. The next day, as the atmosphere in the company remained heavy and subdued, I began to realize that things were changing rapidly. Everyone in the company, those who had devoted decades to building and growing this place, seemed to feel left behind. Those who could retire were starting to plan their exit. I saw many of the old-timers, those who had worked here since they were young, preparing for their final days at the company. Some had already made plans to start a new life, leaving the company behind to seek other opportunities. This made me think about myself. This company had been an important part of my life. I had been with it for over 18 years. I wasn't just an employee, I was part of the company's growth. The memories, the conversations, the challenges, and the successes were all tied to this company. I had witnessed so many changes, from the early days when there were only a few of us to when we became one of the leading suppliers in the industry. Now, faced with the decision of whether to reapply or not, I couldn't help but feel a deep sadness. The reason I stayed all these years was because of my connection to the company, to my colleagues, to the values we had built together. But now, everything was changing too quickly and too suddenly. Could I continue working in an environment where everything wasn't the same as before? Could I overlook these changes and work for a new group of owners, people I didn't even know? I started thinking about my colleagues, those who had been with the company as long as I had. Some were deciding to retire, others were looking for new jobs. But for some, this decision wasn't easy. They had been too attached to the company. And for them, it was more than just a job. It was a part of their life. But with the current conditions, no one could bear it. A few close colleagues of mine had decided not to return. They felt betrayed and couldn't accept starting over under such harsh conditions. We had once been a family facing so many difficulties and challenges together, but now just one cold decision from the investors had torn everything apart. I couldn't help but think about the future of the company. Those with years of experience, the ones who had built it all, were now walking out the door. What would happen to the company? Could the newcomers, who didn't understand our industry or how we operated, replace everything we had built? These questions lingered in my mind, and I couldn't find the answers. The feelings of disappointment, confusion, and anxiety spread through me. But perhaps it was time for me to face this change. What I had given, the memories I had made, would always stay with me, but I couldn't keep clinging to the past. With each passing day, the changes in the company became more evident. Everything seemed to be falling into chaos. The people with years of experience, those who had helped the company stand strong through numerous challenges, were now leaving, taking with them valuable knowledge that no one could immediately replace. Those of us left behind felt lost, unsure of where the company was headed. I began to realize that not just me but all of us were facing a massive challenge. The machines that the company had invested in and developed over many years now had no one to operate and maintain them as we once did. These weren't ordinary machines, but specialized equipment, custom-built for our production process. We had created our products using these machines, and they weren't just tools of labor, they were an integral part of the production process that we had painstakingly built. Then I started hearing stories from colleagues about the difficulties they would face without the skilled workers who remained. Those who had dedicated their lives to maintaining and servicing the machines were now gone, leaving a huge gap. I couldn't help but imagine what that would look like. Would the new owners find a way to keep production running, or would they face a massive productivity crisis? Although no one wanted to admit it, it was clear that the lack of skilled workers, those who knew every detail of the machinery, was an undeniable loss. We had become so familiar with the work, the steps of the process, the sounds of the machines. But now, all that knowledge had walked out the door, and the newcomers couldn't possibly replace it right away. We, the ones who had been here for decades, could already tell that the company would face significant challenges in maintaining production. Technical issues, the shortage of skilled labor, and deep industry knowledge would surely have a major impact on the company. And without timely changes, the company could be at great risk in the future. The feeling of disappointment and anxiety slowly spread, not just within me, but among all my colleagues. The investors' decisions, while perhaps financially sound, didn't account for the intangible values we had built over the years. They couldn't see the worth of the people who had made the company's success, those who had given everything to lay the strong foundation that was now being torn apart. Given the current situation, I couldn't help but wonder if the company would continue to exist in the long run. The people with deep knowledge about the products, the machines, and the production process were gone, leaving a gap that would be hard to fill. What would the newcomers be able to do when they didn't have a deep understanding of what had been built over so many years? These questions kept spinning in my mind, and I couldn't find the answers. That day, as I walked into the company and looked around, I realized that it no longer felt the same. The machines and equipment that we had grown so familiar with now had no one with the knowledge to operate them properly. A void, not just physically but also spiritually, hung in the air. The people who had been the backbone of the company, the ones who understood every minute detail of the process, were now gone. The feeling of disappointment and anxiety spread throughout, not just within me, but in everyone left behind. Although I knew the company could still operate, this loss would undoubtedly affect the quality of the products and the pace of work. The sense of frustration grew stronger as I observed the new employees, those who didn't understand the company, merely following instructions from above, without any knowledge of what had happened in the past. They felt like strange, unfamiliar figures, unable to replace those who had built and maintained the company. A few people started leaving. Those who had worked here for 20 or 30 years were preparing for their retirement. They weren't just employees, they were friends, people who had shared countless challenges with me. But now, they were gone, and I could feel that a part of the company had left with them. This separation wasn't just losing a worker, it was losing a piece of the company's history, its soul. Even the senior leaders, the ones who had steered the company through many storms, couldn't bear this sudden change. They too were leaving, taking with them not only their knowledge and experience, but also the guidance and vision we needed to move forward. I began to wonder, could the new people continue this long journey when they didn't have the understanding and connection that we had? As I stood in a corner of the office looking at the empty desks, I couldn't help but feel a deep sadness. Everything seemed to be spiraling downward. I remembered the early days when I joined the company, full of hope and passion. But now, what remained was emptiness, and a feeling of loss I couldn't describe. The investors probably thought they could buy everything without facing any challenges, but they couldn't see the intangible values we had built. No machine or equipment could replace the people who had given everything. Everything now seemed to be on the brink, and I didn't know where the company was headed in the future. At this point, I felt a mix of regret and anger. Part of me wanted to stay and see what would happen next, but another part wanted to leave, to not witness this any longer. The chaos and confusion made it difficult to make an immediate decision. Could I continue working in a company I no longer recognized? The answer could only come with time. But I knew that no matter what decision I made, what we had built would always remain, in memories that could never be forgotten.